70 to 85 million people. Let that number sit for a moment before we go any further. Not a statistic on a page, not an abstraction. 70 to 85 million individual human beings who had names, families, and futures that were taken from them between 1939 and 1945. 1 in every 25 people alive on Earth at the time. Gone. The Second World War was not an act of nature. It was not an inevitable collision of forces too large for human beings to control. It was built, decision by decision, miscalculation by miscalculation, failure of courage by failure of courage, by people who were, for the most part, trying to do what seemed most reasonable in the specific moment they were living through. That is the most uncomfortable truth about the worst catastrophe in human history. It was made by ordinary political processes, ordinary human fears, and ordinary institutional failures operating under extraordinary pressure. Most documentaries about the Second World War tell you what happened. This one asks something harder. At how many points between 1919 and 1939 did the road fork? How many times could a different decision by a different person have sent history somewhere else entirely? The answer changes everything about how you understand the world you are living in right now. This is not a story about monsters and heroes, though both existed in extraordinary numbers. It is a story about decisions made by exhausted statesmen in rooms that smelled of cigarettes and old wood, made by generals staring at maps in the middle of the night, made by ordinary people caught inside forces so large they could not see the shape of them clearly enough to resist. 70 to 85 million people died inside those decisions. This is their story. And it begins not in 1939. It begins in the wreckage of the war that was supposed to make another one impossible. Chapter 1. The Broken Peace. Picture a room in Paris in the summer of 1919. Outside, the streets are full of soldiers who survived 4 years of industrial slaughter. Men who had watched their friends dissolve into mud at the Somme. Men who had breathed chlorine gas in the trenches of Ypres. Men who had come home missing pieces of themselves that no doctor could reattach. Inside that room, the leaders of Britain, France, the United States, and Italy were trying to answer the question that no peace conference in history had successfully answered. How do you end a war in a way that does not simply plant the seeds of the next one? They failed. Not because they were stupid. Several of them were genuinely brilliant. They failed because the political pressures tearing them in opposite directions were stronger than any single vision of a durable peace. And the document they produced, the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28th of 1919, created a map of Europe that almost nobody was willing to defend, and that one particular nation was absolutely determined to destroy. To understand why, you have to understand what the First World War had actually cost. France lost 1.4 million soldiers dead. Britain lost nearly 900,000. A generation of young men had been fed into a machine of barbed wire, artillery, and poison gas at a scale that no previous war in human history had approached. The populations of the victorious nations were not in a mood for generosity toward the country they held responsible. They wanted punishment. They wanted guarantees. They wanted absolute certainty that nothing like what they had just lived through could ever happen again. Georges Clemenceau of France understood what his population demanded. Germany must be weakened permanently, its military capacity crushed, its economy burdened, its national pride reduced to something that could never again threaten French security. Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived with a different vision entirely. His 14 points proposed a peace based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, and a new international body called the League of Nations that would resolve future disputes without war. Wilson believed, with the genuine conviction of a man who had never quite outgrown his idealism, that this was the architecture of permanent peace. He was partly right about the vision. He was almost entirely wrong about whether the other men in that room shared it. David Lloyd George of Britain occupied the uncomfortable middle ground. His population wanted Germany punished. His own instincts told him that a Germany humiliated beyond endurance would eventually become dangerous. He negotiated accordingly, trying to satisfy a public appetite for revenge while quietly worrying about the consequences. What they produced was a compromise that satisfied no one and endangered everyone. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. It lost Alsace-Lorraine to France. It lost significant eastern territories to the newly created state of Poland. Its army was limited to 100,000 men. Its navy was stripped of submarines and major surface vessels. The Rhineland, the buffer zone between Germany and France, was to be occupied by Allied troops and permanently demilitarized. And then there was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies were required to accept full moral and legal responsibility for causing the war. This was the justification for reparations, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure so enormous that Germany would still be making payments on it decades later. The historian Margaret Macmillan, in her detailed study of the Paris Peace Conference, published in 2001, argues that the treaty was neither as harsh as its German critics claimed, nor as lenient as its Allied defenders suggested. It was a compromise peace that carried within it the contradictions of the political moment that produced it. Germany was weakened, but not destroyed, humiliated but not dismembered, left with enough industrial capacity to eventually rebuild, and enough accumulated grievance to want to. The League of Nations, Wilson's greatest hope, was established but immediately crippled. The United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. The country whose own president had created the organization never joined it. The League had no army of its own, no mechanism to enforce its decisions against a determined aggressor. It was, as critics pointed out almost immediately, a vehicle for status quo powers to maintain what they had won, not a genuine instrument of collective security. Germany's response was immediate and unanimous. Across the political spectrum, from the democratic center to the nationalist right, Germans described Versailles as a diktat, a dictated peace imposed by force. The War Guilt Clause was experienced not as a legal formality, but as a national humiliation. Reparations, payments, flowing out of an already devastated economy, became a daily reminder of national defeat. Into this environment came the Weimar Republic, the democratic government established after the Kaiser's abdication in November of 1918. It was born at the worst possible moment, associated in the public mind with defeat it had inherited rather than caused, attacked from both left and right from its very first days. Then came 1923. Germany defaulted on reparations payments. France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government financed resistance by printing money. The result was hyperinflation so extreme that it entered historical legend. By November of 1923, it took 420 billion marks to buy what 1 mark had bought before the war. People carried money to market in wheelbarrows. Life savings became worthless overnight. The psychological damage of that experience never fully left the generation that lived through it. The Republic stabilized in the mid-1920s. American loans under the Dawes Plan helped restructure German debt. A period of genuine recovery and remarkable cultural creativity followed. The Weimar years produced some of the most extraordinary art, literature, and film in modern history. Berlin became one of the most dynamic cities in the world. But the stability was fragile in ways that only became visible when tested. Then, in October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. What followed was the Great Depression, the most severe economic catastrophe in the history of industrial capitalism. American banks called in their loans. The flow of capital that had sustained German recovery stopped overnight. Factories closed. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed, roughly 30% of the workforce. Millions more worked for wages that barely covered subsistence. The historian Adam Tooze, in his detailed economic analysis of Nazi Germany published in 2006, describes the Great Depression as the essential precondition for the Nazi seizure of power. Not because economic suffering automatically produces fascism, but because it destroyed the credibility of the democratic center. The parties that had governed Germany through the 1920s had no answer that satisfied enough people. Coalition governments collapsed. Emergency rule by presidential decree replaced parliamentary democracy. The institutional habits of democratic deliberation that might have resisted the extremes were corroded precisely when they were most needed. The Nazi Party had won only 2.5% of the vote in 1928. It won 37% in July of 1932. Adolf Hitler had been a marginal figure through the 1920s, a veteran who blamed Germany's defeat on a conspiracy of Jews and Marxists. A failed coup in Munich in 1923. 9 months in prison, writing a book that almost nobody read. His party had organizational energy and a talent for political theater. But its message of racial nationalism and violent resentment had limited appeal when the economy was functional. The Depression changed everything. It did not create the message. It created the audience. What Hitler offered was not a coherent economic program. The policy details were deliberately vague. What he offered was an explanation and a scapegoat. Germany had been betrayed. The betrayers were identifiable. The humiliation of Versailles could be reversed. National greatness could be restored. The appeal was emotional rather than rational. And it worked because emotions were what the moment was running on. Franz von Papen, the conservative politician who persuaded the aging President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in January of 1933, was convinced that Hitler could be managed, that his extreme impulses would be contained by conservative ministers surrounding him in the cabinet, that the machinery of government would discipline the radical outsider once he was inside it. Von Papen was wrong in a way that shaped everything that followed. Within 6 months of becoming chancellor, Hitler had used the Reichstag fire of February of 1933 to suspend civil liberties by emergency decree. He had pushed the Enabling Act through a cowed parliament, giving himself legal authority to rule without legislative oversight. He had banned trade unions, banned all political parties except his own. The Weimar Republic ceased to exist not through violent revolution, but through legal mechanisms wielded by a man who understood that the quickest way to destroy a democracy was to use its own procedures against it. Here is the question historians have debated ever since. Was this outcome inevitable from the moment the ink dried on the Treaty of Versailles? The honest answer is no. At almost every point between 1919 and 1933. Different decisions could have led somewhere different. A less punitive peace might have given the Weimar Republic stronger foundations. Continued American financial engagement might have cushioned the Depression's impact. Conservative politicians might have refused to hand power to a man whose intentions were clearly visible to anyone who had read his book. None of these things happened, not because they were impossible, but because the specific combination of exhaustion, fear, and miscalculation that existed in that particular moment made them unlikely enough that they did not occur. That is not destiny. It is the accumulated weight of ordinary human decisions made by people doing what seemed most practical, most politically survivable, most likely to satisfy the pressures they were under right now, without fully reckoning with where the road they were choosing actually led. The world was about to find out where it led. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Third Reich. Hitler did not take German democracy. German democracy, exhausted and cornered, handed itself to him. On January 30th of 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The old Field Marshal Hindenburg, 85 years old and visibly failing, had resisted the appointment for years. He reportedly referred to Hitler as the Bohemian Corporal, a phrase that captured the aristocratic contempt Germany's traditional establishment felt toward this loud, Provincial, socially awkward, former private from Austria. Hindenburg finally signed the papers because the alternative seemed worse. Another round of unstable coalition government. Fresh elections that might strengthen the communists further. Hitler, the conservatives believed, could be controlled. Franz von Papen reportedly told a friend that evening that they had hired Hitler. Within 2 months, the opposite was true. The speed with which Hitler dismantled German democratic institutions between January and July of 1933 remains one of the most studied sequences in modern political history. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was so methodical, each step grounded in legal procedure, each move presented as a response to emergency rather than a deliberate power grab. The Reichstag fire of February 27th of 1933 came first. The fire destroyed the German parliament building. It was almost certainly set by Marinus van der Lubbe, a young Dutch communist acting alone. Whether elements of the Nazi leadership knew in advance remains debated among historians. The historian Richard Evans, in his detailed history of the Third Reich, notes that the evidence for Nazi foreknowledge is suggestive but not conclusive. What is not debated is how Hitler used it. Within 24 hours, he had persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending constitutional guarantees of free speech, free press, and freedom of assembly. The decree remained in effect until 1945. The Enabling Act followed in March. To pass it, the Nazis needed a 2/3 parliamentary majority. They achieved this through their own seats. Conservative coalition partners. The physical intimidation of opposition members by stormtroopers positioned inside and outside the building, and the arrest of communist deputies following the fire. The Social Democrats, the only party to vote against the act, did so knowing they could not stop it. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave a speech that was simultaneously an act of political courage and a political epitaph. He was heard. He was ignored. The act passed. With the Enabling Act, Hitler had what he needed: legal authority to govern by decree for 4 years. He never needed to renew it in any meaningful sense, because by the time it would have expired, there was no parliament left to consult. The consolidation moved with stunning speed. Trade unions banned, and assets seized in May. All political parties dissolved or banned by July. Nazi Germany was legally a one-party state 7 months after Hitler became chancellor. The press, brought under the authority of Joseph Goebbels and his new Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The civil service purged of Jews and political opponents under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April with bureaucratic efficiency. Each step generated protest from some quarters, compliance from many more. The historian Robert Gellatly, in his study of popular opinion in Nazi Germany, published in 2001, documents the extent to which a significant portion of the German population actively supported, passively accepted, or simply adapted to the new order. Some were enthusiastic ideological converts. Many more were people who calculated that cooperation was safer than resistance, that the new government might actually deliver on its promises of national renewal, that they had families to protect and jobs to keep. The one serious challenge from within the movement came in June of 1934. The Night of the Long Knives. Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA stormtroopers, commanded a paramilitary force of roughly 2 million men and had ambitions for a second revolution that would replace the traditional German army with his own organization. Hitler faced a choice between the revolutionary energy that had brought him to power and the institutional military establishment he needed to rearm the country. He chose the army. Over the weekend of June 30th, Rome and dozens of other SA leaders were arrested and shot. Political opponents and personal enemies were killed alongside them. The official death toll was acknowledged at 77. Historians estimate the actual number was considerably higher. Hitler presented the killings as a necessary response to a planned coup. The German cabinet retroactively legalized the murders as acts of state self-defense. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler rather than to the state or constitution. This oath would prove enormously consequential. It bound individual officers to Hitler in a way that made resistance not merely politically dangerous but personally dishonorable by the standards of the military culture they had been trained in. When Hindenburg died in August of 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President. A plebiscite confirmed the merger with 89% approval. The consolidation was complete. The economy recovered substantially through the mid-1930s. Unemployment fell from 6 million in 1932 to under 1 million by 1938. Public works programs, massive rearmament spending, and the removal of Jewish Germans and political opponents from workforce statistics all contributed to numbers the Nazi government presented as proof of its economic genius. For many ordinary Germans, the mid-1930s felt like recovery. Factories were open. Jobs existed. The national humiliation of Versailles was being visibly reversed. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland in March of 1936, openly violating the treaty, and France and Britain had done nothing. Nazi Germany had hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin that summer, presenting a carefully managed image of a modern, dynamic nation to the world. The historian Adam Tooze argues the recovery was real but structurally fragile, dependent on deficit spending and rearmament that was creating pressures the regime was already planning to resolve through territorial conquest rather than sustainable policy. But for people who had lived through hyperinflation and mass unemployment, what they could see felt real enough. Behind that appearance, something else was being constructed. The systematic exclusion and persecution of Jewish Germans proceeded in escalating stages throughout the 1930s. The Nuremberg Laws of September of 1935 defined Jewish identity in racial rather than religious terms. They stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship, prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The definition extended to grandparents, ensnaring people who had never identified primarily as Jewish. The laws created a bureaucratic apparatus of exclusion that touched every aspect of life. Jewish professionals banned from practicing law, medicine, and teaching. Jewish businesses subjected to state-organized boycotts. Jewish children progressively excluded from public schools. The cumulative effect was to mark Jews as a category of person outside the national community, subject to different rules, entitled to different treatment. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, on November 9th and 10th of 1938, marked the moment. Systematic exclusion exploded into open, organized violence. Across Nazi Germany and Austria, party members and stormtroopers attacked Jewish businesses, synagogue, and homes. More than 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Over 250 synagogues burned. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. German authorities acknowledged at least 91 deaths, though historians, including Peter Longerich, argue the actual death toll was considerably higher and that many deaths went unreported. The response from the Nazi government was to fine the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage, on the grounds that Jewish provocations had caused the violence against them. The international reaction was condemnation. Ambassadors were recalled. Public statements of outrage were issued. And then, after a brief pause, the business of accommodation resumed, because the other governments of Europe and the United States were operating inside their own constraints, their own calculations, their own population's reluctance to risk another war over events in a foreign country. The rearmament proceeding since 1933 was by 1938 producing an army, air force, and navy of real and growing power. Hitler had demonstrated repeatedly that treaty violations produced diplomatic protests rather than military responses. He had absorbed Austria in March of 1938, welcomed by a significant portion of the Austrian population even as it was imposed under military threat. The Munich Agreement of September of 1938 gave Hitler the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia, over the objections of the Czechoslovak government, which was not present at the conference that disposed of its own territory. Chamberlain returned to London and told a cheering crowd he had brought back peace with honor. He was wrong about the honor. He would be wrong about the peace within 6 months. The historical debate about appeasement continues. Some historians argue Chamberlain was buying time that Britain needed to rearm. Others contend it destroyed the last realistic opportunity to stop Hitler before the war became unavoidable. What the historical record supports clearly is this: each concession made Hitler's next demand easier to justify and harder to resist. Each time, the Western democracies accepted a violation without meaningful response. They confirmed Hitler's assessment that they would not fight. And that assessment, more than any single military calculation, is what made the invasion of Poland possible. Chapter 3: The World on the Edge. Most histories of the Second World War begin in Europe. They start with Hitler, with Versailles, with the long chain of diplomatic failures that ended in the invasion of Poland. That framing is understandable. It is also incomplete. In one crucial sense, the global war began in China before it formally began in Europe, 2 full years before a single German soldier crossed a European border, in a conflict that killed more people than several entire European campaigns combined, and that the rest of the world watched with a distance it would later come to regret. Japan, in the 1930s, was a country under profound internal tension, an industrial power without the natural resources industrial power required. Humiliated at the Washington Naval Conference of 1922, where the major powers agreed to a ratio of naval tonnage that left Japan with a smaller fleet than the United States and Britain. Japanese military leaders, particularly in the army, saw expansion into continental Asia not as aggression but as strategic necessity. The acquisition of raw materials, oil, iron, and food that the home islands could not provide in sufficient quantity. The Manchurian Incident of September of 1931 established the pattern that would define Japanese expansion for the next decade. Officers of the Kwantung Army staged a fake attack on a Japanese-owned railway as a pretext for invading Manchuria. The civilian government in Tokyo had not ordered it, had not been consulted, but found itself unable to reverse what the military had done. Partly because reversing it would have required confronting an army establishment with a dangerous habit of assassinating politicians whose policies it opposed, and partly because the conquest was genuinely popular with a Japanese public that had been told for years that expansion was necessary and honorable. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Japan withdrew from the League. The pattern of international censure without consequence was already established. Full-scale war between Japan and China broke out in July of 1937. Shanghai fell to Japanese forces in November after 3 months of intense urban combat that cost both sides casualties in the hundreds of thousands. The nationalist Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the interior, losing its industrial base and coastal ports, but maintaining enough territory and manpower to continue resistance. What happened in Nanjing in December of 1937 and the weeks that followed constitutes one of the most documented atrocities of the 20th century and one of the least discussed outside Asia. When Japanese forces entered the Chinese capital, their commanding officers lost, abandoned, or deliberately relinquished control over their troops. What followed was 6 weeks of systematic killing, rape, and destruction. Careful modern scholarly estimates, including work by historians such as Tokushi Kasahara, place the death toll between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Primary source evidence includes contemporary Japanese military diaries, diplomatic cabal, and testimony from foreigners who remained in Nanjing and established a safety zone that sheltered roughly 200,000 civilians. The international response was outrage expressed in diplomatic language. And then, once again, business as usual. The United States condemned the violence. It also continued selling scrap metal and oil to Japan. Britain issued formal protests. It also continued trading. The distance between what was happening in China and what mattered to Western publics preoccupied with their own economic recovery and their own fears of another European war was too great for moral revulsion to translate into political action. This established something important about the late 1930s. The international system had mechanisms for expressing disapproval. It had almost no mechanisms for enforcing consequence. Aggression carried real costs only when the nations with the power to impose those costs were willing to pay the price of doing so. In 1937 and 1938, none of them were. Back in Europe, the crisis over Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland brought the strategy of appeasement to its most famous and most debated test. Czechoslovakia was not a weak state. It had a modern army of roughly 35 divisions, well-equipped and well-trained. Its frontier fortifications were genuinely formidable. Military analysts at the time, and historians since, have argued that a German attack on Czechoslovakia in 1938 would have been far more costly and potentially far less successful than what occurred in 1939 against Poland. But the military equation was never properly tested. France and Britain chose diplomacy over confrontation. The Munich Agreement of September of 1938 gave Hitler the Sudetenland, and with it, the fortifications that made Czechoslovakia defensible. 6 months later, in March of 1939, Hitler occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia entirely, violating the terms of the agreement he had signed, taking a country with no German majority, with no pretext of ethnic reunification, simply because he could. Prague was the moment that finally shifted British and French policy. It was no longer possible to argue that Hitler was pursuing legitimate grievances through aggressive but manageable methods. Britain and France issued guarantees to Poland, Romania, and Greece. The Soviet Union was the critical variable that both sides needed, and neither fully trusted. Stalin had been systematically dismantling the professional competence of the Red Army since 1937. When the Great Purge killed or imprisoned 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and a devastating proportion of experienced officers at every level. The military that emerged was technically equipped but institutionally traumatized, led by men who had survived partly through loyalty to Stalin rather than military competence, and who had learned that delivering bad news to superiors carried potentially fatal consequences. Britain and France negotiated with the Soviet Union through the summer of 1939 with a lack of urgency that reflected mutual suspicion. Stalin, watching the Western powers hand pieces of Eastern Europe to Hitler while declining to commit to collective action, drew his own conclusions about the reliability of capitalist democracies as allies. The announcement on August 23rd of 1939 shook the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, 2 states that had spent years defining each other as existential enemies. Nazi ideology identified Bolshevism as a Jewish Marxist conspiracy to destroy civilization. Soviet doctrine identified fascism as the last desperate defense of dying capitalism. The ideological hostility was genuine and deep, but ideology bent before strategic calculation. For Hitler, the pact eliminated the threat of a 2-front war while he dealt with Poland. For Stalin, it bought time and territory. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. On September 1st of 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border from the west, north, and south. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had formally begun. But here is what that date conceals. The war did not begin because of a sudden eruption of forces that nobody had seen building. It began because of a decade of decisions, each one made by people who believed they were managing a dangerous situation in the most reasonable way available to them. Each one making the next decision harder, the options fewer, the road narrower. Versailles created grievances. The Depression weaponized them. Appeasement validated them. The failure to build genuine collective security left each country calculating individual survival rather than collective interest. The world that entered September of 1939 did so not because war was the only possible outcome of everything that had come before. It did so because at each fork in the road, the path that led somewhere else required more political courage, more institutional imagination, and more willingness to pay a cost in the present to prevent a catastrophe in the future than the people making the decisions were able or willing to provide. The German army that crossed into Poland was about to show the world a new way of making war. And the world was about to discover that nothing it thought it knew about modern conflict was adequate preparation for what was coming. Chapter 4. Blitzkrieg. The world learns a new word. There is a common misunderstanding about what made the German military so devastatingly effective in the opening years of the war. The popular image is of overwhelming force, a machine so large and so powerful that resistance was simply futile. The reality is more interesting and more instructive than that. Nazi Germany did not win its early campaigns because it had more men or more equipment. In several cases, it had less. It won because it had developed a way of fighting that turned the psychological dimension of warfare into a weapon as decisive as any tank or artillery piece. Speed and shock applied at the right point could paralyze an enemy's decision-making faster than that enemy could organize a response. The goal was not to destroy the opposing army through attrition. It was to collapse its ability to function as a coordinated force. Tanks, motorized infantry, and aircraft working together would punch through the weakest point in an enemy line, bypass strong points rather than attacking them directly, and drive deep into the rear areas where headquarters and supply depots were located. Create a situation so chaotic and so psychologically overwhelming that organized resistance became impossible before it could be properly organized. The German army gave its junior officers a degree of initiative and independent judgment that most other armies did not. A company commander who saw an opportunity was expected to seize it without waiting for orders from above. A battalion commander whose orders had been overtaken by rapidly changing circumstances was expected to adapt rather than wait for updated instructions that might arrive too late to matter. This meant the German army could exploit opportunities at a speed that centrally controlled armies could not match. By the time an opponent's headquarters had identified what was happening, reported it up the chain of command, received a decision, and transmitted orders back down, the situation had already changed enough that those orders were partially obsolete. Poland experienced this reality beginning on September 1st of 1939. The German attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, with roughly 1.5 million soldiers, 2,500 tanks, and nearly 2,000 aircraft. The Polish army was neither as small nor as incompetent as later mythology suggested. It had roughly 1 million men under arms. Its cavalry, contrary to the famous story, did not charge German tanks with lances. Its air force, though outmatched, fought with real skill, but the Polish military was organized for a different kind of war. Its forces spread along a border of nearly 1,700 kilometers. The German strategy created multiple crises simultaneously, forcing the Polish high command to make decisions under pressure without adequate information or communications. When orders were transmitted, the situation had already shifted. The gap between what Polish commanders thought was happening and what was actually happening widened continuously from the first hours. The Soviet invasion from the east on September 17th, following the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, eliminated whatever operational space the Polish army might have used for a fighting retreat. Poland was being compressed from both sides simultaneously. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. Organized resistance ended by early October. Less than 5 weeks. The Western Allies had declared war, but done almost nothing to affect the outcome. France had the largest army in Western Europe and a treaty obligation to attack Germany within 2 weeks of mobilization. The attack that occurred was a cautious probe into the Saar region involving 9 divisions that advanced a few kilometers, encountered light resistance, and then stopped well short of the Siegfried Line. It was withdrawn entirely before the end of September. What followed was the phony war, from October of 1939 until April of 1940. Germany and the Western Allies faced each other across the border, and almost nothing happened. On the surface, it looked like a standoff. In reality, it was a period of diverging preparation. Germany was planning its next move. France and Britain were hoping that economic pressure, the naval blockade gradually strangling German imports, would eventually force a negotiated settlement without requiring the kind of offensive operation that both governments feared would produce casualties on a First World War scale. The illusion shattered in April of 1940. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Denmark fell in a single day. The Allied attempt to intervene in Norway revealed the operational gap between the German military and its opponents in painful detail. Allied forces were disorganized, poorly coordinated, and consistently outmaneuvered by German troops who displayed exactly the kind of initiative that their training produced. The Norway disaster brought down the British government. Neville Chamberlain resigned on May 9th of 1940. The man who replaced him was Winston Churchill. He became Prime Minister on May 10th of 1940. The same day, Germany launched its attack on France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The fall of France is one of the most analyzed campaigns in military history. France was not defeated because it lacked soldiers, equipment, or courage. It was defeated because its military thinking had calcified around assumptions that the German army had deliberately designed its campaign to exploit. The German plan, developed largely through the strategic imagination of General Erich von Manstein, placed the main armored thrust not through Belgium, where the Allies expected it and had positioned their best forces, but through the Ardennes. 7 armored divisions moved through terrain that French doctrine had classified as impassable for tanks, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13th, and began driving northwest toward the English Channel coast. The maneuver worked because it was unexpected, because it moved faster than French headquarters could process what was happening, and because the institutional culture of the French army made rapid response at lower levels extremely difficult. French commanders who understood what the breakthrough meant and wanted to counterattack found their requests for authorization moving slowly up a chain of command that was itself struggling to comprehend a situation that had no precedent in its planning. By May 20th, German armored forces had reached the Channel coast. The Allied armies in Belgium, including the British Expeditionary Force of roughly 300,000 men, were cut off. The trap had closed before the people inside it had fully understood they were being trapped. What followed at Dunkirk has entered history as a kind of miracle. Between 338,000 British and French soldiers were lifted off the beaches and harbor by naval vessels and civilian boats that crossed the Channel repeatedly under German air attack. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. It was also a military catastrophe dressed in the language of heroism, which was precisely the framing that the political moment required. The men who came home from Dunkirk came home without their equipment, without their vehicles, without most of their artillery. The capability to fight had largely been left on the beaches. Hitler's decision to halt the armored advance before it reached Dunkirk remains one of the most discussed decisions of the entire war. Whether the halt reflected genuine operational concerns about the armored forces needing rest, Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, or some political calculation about leaving a door open for British negotiations, historians continue to debate. Whatever the reason, the halt allowed the evacuation to proceed far more completely than German planning had anticipated. The 338,000 men who reached England would form the core of the army that eventually fought on the beaches of Normandy. France, formally surrendered on June 22nd of 1940. The armistice was signed in the same railway carriage at Compiègne where Germany had signed its armistice in November of 1918. A piece of deliberate historical theater that Hitler had arranged with the precision of someone who understood exactly what symbols do to people. 6 weeks from the opening of the campaign to the armistice, the military balance in Europe had shifted more completely than most outside observers had understood. Britain stood alone, and the man who had become its prime minister 10 weeks earlier now faced a question that had no comfortable answer. Chapter 5. Britain Alone. On the evening of May 13th of 1940, 3 days after becoming prime minister, with German armored columns already driving through the Ardennes, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons and delivered a speech that lasted approximately 6 minutes. He had nothing to offer, he told the assembled members, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His policy was to wage war by sea, land, and air with all the might and strength that God could give. His aim was victory. Without victory, there could be no survival. The speech is remembered as one of the defining moments of the war. What is less remembered is the political reality behind it. Churchill was not yet secure in his position. He had enemies within his own war cabinet, and the most dangerous of them, the man who sat closest to the levers of power and who represented a strain of thinking more widespread than later memory acknowledged, was Lord Halifax, Edward Frederick Linley Wood, the first Earl of Halifax, was Foreign Secretary in the government Churchill had just formed. He was not a coward, not a Nazi sympathizer. He was a serious, experienced statesman who looked at the military situation in May of 1940 with clear eyes and reached a conclusion he believed was the only rational one available. Britain could not win the war alone. Nazi Germany controlled the continent. Italy was about to enter the war on the German side. The United States was not yet a belligerent. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Under these circumstances, Halifax argued, Britain should explore whether a negotiated settlement was possible, perhaps through Italian mediation. That would preserve British independence while accepting German dominance of the European continent. He was not proposing unconditional surrender. He was proposing what he considered a realistic assessment of limited options. The debates within the War Cabinet between May 26th and May 28th of 1940, reconstructed in detail by the historian John Lukacs in his study published in 1999, represent one of the most consequential internal political struggles of the entire war. Churchill argued with increasing emotional force over 3 days that any approach to Hitler through Mussolini would destroy British credibility and fighting spirit irreversibly. Once it became known that Britain was seeking terms, resistance would collapse. The only path was to fight on, regardless of the odds. Churchill won the argument, but the argument Halifax made did not disappear. It represented a strain of political realism that existed throughout British society, and that Churchill had to keep defeating not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through the sustained maintenance of a fighting spirit he manufactured, in significant part, through language. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. This was not a military assessment. It was a statement of will designed to make surrender psychologically impossible by declaring it publicly and repeatedly as a value that Britain would not compromise. The practical question behind the rhetoric was whether Britain could actually survive a German invasion attempt. Operation Sea Lion. The German plan for crossing the English Channel required German air superiority over the Channel and the landing beaches. Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe were tasked with destroying the Royal Air Force as a fighting force. The Battle of Britain, which lasted from July to October of 1940, was fought primarily by young men in propeller aircraft at altitudes where the cold was severe and the margin between surviving and not was measured in seconds. The Royal Air Force, commanded by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, was fighting a defensive battle with a crucial structural advantage. Every German pilot who went down over England was a prisoner or a casualty. Every British pilot who went down over England had a chance of returning to his squadron the same day. The Luftwaffe had an advantage in numbers. The Royal Air Force had an advantage in radar. The chain-home system gave Fighter Command early warning of incoming raids and allowed it to deploy limited forces efficiently rather than maintaining standing patrols that would have exhausted pilots and burned through aircraft. By late August of 1940, Fighter Command was under serious pressure. Aircraft production was keeping pace with losses. Pilot production was not. The operational tempo was wearing down the experienced men who knew how to survive and fight effectively, replacing them with freshly trained pilots who knew how to fly their aircraft, but not yet how to stay alive in them. Then Hitler made one of the critical errors of the entire war. On August 24th, German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on central London, the first time the city had been bombed. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The Berlin raid caused limited physical damage, but enormous psychological damage to Göring's credibility, since he had publicly promised the German public that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the Reich's capital. Hitler responded with fury, ordering the Luftwaffe to shift its primary target from Royal Air Force airfields and radar stations to London itself. The shift relieved the pressure on Fighter Command at precisely the moment when that pressure was becoming critical. The airfields that had been damaged could be repaired. The operational pressure grinding down the pilot corps was suddenly reduced. Fighter Command survived. By October of 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost enough aircraft and experienced aircrew that achieving the air superiority required for an invasion was no longer a realistic near-term prospect. Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. The Blitz, the sustained bombing of London and other British cities that continued through the spring of 1941, killed approximately 43,000 British civilians and destroyed large portions of London, Coventry, Birmingham, Plymouth, and other cities. The psychological effect was the opposite of what German planners had anticipated. Rather than breaking civilian morale and creating pressure for negotiated peace, the bombing produced a solidarity and stubborn determination that became central to British national identity. The civilians who sheltered in the London Underground during bombing raids, the firefighters and air raid wardens who worked through the nights, the ordinary people who showed up to work the morning after their street had been destroyed. These became the human face of what Churchill's rhetoric had described and what the reality of the Blitz, in its way, actually produced. Across the Atlantic, Franklin Roosevelt was navigating a political landscape of considerable complexity. The United States was constitutionally neutral, and its public deeply reluctant to enter another European war. The memory of the First World War, the sense that American boys had died to settle European disputes that resumed anyway, was alive and politically powerful. Roosevelt understood, earlier and more clearly than much of his public, that a Europe dominated by Nazi Germany was incompatible with American security and American values. He was constrained in how directly he could act on that understanding by a political environment in which the most prominent voices of opposition to intervention included genuine isolationists alongside many entirely honorable Americans, who simply did not believe their country should be drawn into another foreign war. The Lend-Lease Act, signed in March of 1941, represented the furthest Roosevelt could push American policy without triggering a political backlash that might cost him the ability to push further later. It authorized the president to transfer military equipment to any nation whose defense he deemed vital to American security. In practice, it meant Britain could receive American ships, aircraft, tanks, and supplies without the cash terms that would have quickly exhausted British financial reserves. Churchill understood what this meant. His strategy from the first days of his premiership was not primarily to find a military path to victory through British resources alone. It was to survive long enough and fight credibly enough to convince the United States that supporting Britain was strategically necessary and that British resistance was not a lost cause being prolonged at American expense. Every speech, every demonstration of British will, every successful engagement, also a message directed at Washington. That calculation was about to be made irrelevant by events on the other side of the world, and by a decision made in Tokyo that would bring the United States into the war with a speed and totality that neither Roosevelt's cautious maneuvering nor Churchill's patient persuasion could have achieved on its own timeline. But before that happened, something of even larger scale was about to occur. On June 22nd of 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. Chapter 6. Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. There is a document in the German military archives that historians have studied for decades because of what it reveals about the assumptions underlying Operation Barbarossa. It is a logistics planning memorandum prepared in the spring of 1941. It contains a calculation that its authors apparently did not find troubling. The German army advancing into the Soviet Union would outrun its supply lines within approximately 300 kilometers of the starting point. Beyond that distance, the campaign would need to sustain itself through captured Soviet resources. The calculation was not presented as a problem requiring a solution. It was presented as an operational reality to be managed. That single document captures something essential about the greatest military gamble of the Second World War. Operation Barbarossa was not planned as a long campaign. It was planned as a short one. The Soviet Union, in the assessment of Hitler and most of the German military leadership, was a structure so rotten at its foundations that a few powerful blows would bring the entire edifice down. The purges of the Red Army Officer Corps that Stalin had conducted between 1937 and 1939 had stripped the Soviet military of an enormous proportion of its experienced leadership. The performance of the Red Army in the Winter War against Finland, where Soviet forces had struggled for months to defeat a nation of approximately 3.5 million people before prevailing through sheer weight of numbers, seemed to confirm the assessment. The campaign was expected to last between 8 and 12 weeks. The phrase senior German officers used repeatedly in their planning documents was that Russia was a house of cards that would collapse when kicked. It was among the most consequential miscalculations in the history of warfare. On June 22nd of 1941, 3 German army groups crossed the Soviet border simultaneously along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow along the historical invasion route Napoleon had used 130 years earlier. Army Group South drove toward Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields. The total force committed was approximately 3 million German soldiers, supported by roughly 600,000 troops from Romania. Hungary, Finland, and Italy. The opening weeks seemed to validate the most optimistic German assessments. Soviet forces were caught in various stages of unpreparedness. Stalin had received consistent and detailed intelligence warnings about the impending invasion from Soviet agents in Tokyo, Berlin, and London. He had refused to believe them. His reasoning, insofar as historians can reconstruct it from fragmented evidence, appears to have combined a genuine assessment that Germany would not attack until it had defeated Britain with a psychological inability to accept information he could not immediately control and respond to. The result was that, when the German attack came, significant portions of the Soviet Air Force were destroyed on the ground in the first hours. Soviet armored units were caught without fuel or ammunition. The command structure that should have coordinated a response was paralyzed by the combination of physical disruption and a culture in which initiative was dangerous and bad news was unwelcome. The historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, in his detailed study of Stalin, published in 2003 and drawing on Soviet archives, opened after the Cold War, describes a leader who suffered something close to psychological collapse in the first days, withdrawing to his dacha, receiving visitors with a manner that some interpreted as wondering whether they had come to arrest him, emerging to reassert control only after it became clear that the system he had built was still holding together and still expecting him to lead it. The German advance in the first months was staggering. Army Group Center encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies in battles that produced prisoner counts on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. The Battle of Kiev in September of 1941 resulted in the capture of approximately 660,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest single encirclement in military history. By the end of October of 1941, German forces had advanced approximately 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory and were within 200 kilometers of Moscow. By December of 1941, the Soviet Union had lost approximately 4.5 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. For any other nation on Earth, losses on this scale would have constituted decisive defeat. The Soviet Union did not collapse. Understanding why requires understanding something about the Soviet state that German planners had systematically failed to account for. The Stalinist system was brutal, wasteful, and murderous in its treatment of its own people. But it had also created, through forced industrialization, an industrial capacity east of the Ural Mountains that was physically beyond the reach of German forces, and a political system so centralized and so coercive that the mechanisms of continued resistance remained functioning even when the military situation was catastrophic. Soviet factories were physically dismantled and moved east by rail in one of the largest industrial relocations in history. Between July and November of 1941, approximately 1,500 major industrial enterprises were transported piece by piece to the Urals, Western Siberia, and Central Asia, reassembled, and put back into production. Workers slept in the factories because there was no time to build housing. The tanks and aircraft they produced began reaching the front in increasing numbers through the autumn and winter. The behavior of German forces towards Soviet civilians and prisoners of war was not merely morally catastrophic. It was strategically counterproductive. The ideological framework Hitler had imposed on the campaign treated the Soviet Union not as a military opponent to be defeated and then governed, but as a racial and ideological enemy to be destroyed and replaced. Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity at a rate that was not accidental. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the course of the war, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate killing. The historian Christian Streit, in his detailed study, published in 1978, documented the systematic nature of this treatment and the decisions at the highest levels of the German military that produced it. For the Soviet population as a whole, the combination of German atrocities and Soviet propaganda produced not the collapse of will that German planners had expected, but its opposite. People who might have been indifferent to the survival of the Stalinist state found themselves fighting for the survival of their families, their villages, their country. The Germans had, through their own conduct, answered the question of whether life under German occupation was preferable to resistance. The German advance toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, began on September 30th of 1941. By mid-October, German forces were close enough that Stalin considered evacuating the government. He chose to remain. The decision was symbolically crucial. A leader who stayed in the city under attack provided a focal point for resistance that an evacuated government could not. The advance slowed in the mud of the autumn rains, then stopped as temperatures dropped below levels for which German soldiers and German equipment had been prepared. German forces had been supplied for a summer campaign. When autumn extended into an early and severe winter, they were fighting in temperatures of -20 and -30 degrees Celsius in summer uniforms, weapons whose lubricants froze, engines that would not start. The Soviet counteroffensive that began on December 5th of 1941 drove German forces back from their closest approach to Moscow. It was not a decisive victory that permanently ended the threat, but it destroyed the myth of German invincibility and demonstrated, for the first time, that the Wehrmacht could be pushed back by a determined opponent with adequate forces. The campaign had been expected to last 12 weeks. It had lasted 6 months and was entering its second winter phase with no end in sight. Supply lines stretched to breaking point, losses that Germany's manpower base could not sustain indefinitely, and an opponent that had absorbed casualties that would have destroyed any other nation and was still fighting. Hitler's response was not to fundamentally reconsider the premises of the campaign. It was to extend his personal control over military decision-making, dismissing generals whose assessments he found unwelcome and increasingly substituting his own operational judgment for that of professional soldiers. In December of 1941, he dismissed the army commander-in-chief and assumed the position himself. The house of cards had not collapsed when kicked. It had absorbed the kick, and it was preparing to kick back. Chapter 7. Global War, Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific. On the morning of November 26th of 1941, a Japanese naval force of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers departed the remote harbor of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands and set course northeast into the North Pacific. Radio silence was maintained throughout the voyage. The ships sailed through some of the worst weather the North Pacific offered in November, which was exactly why the route had been chosen. No commercial shipping used it. No surveillance aircraft patrolled it. The task force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, carried a strike force of approximately 400 aircraft and orders that would not be confirmed as final until the last possible moment. The target was Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. To understand why Japan attacked the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor, you have to understand a decision-making process that was not irrational, even though the outcome it produced was catastrophic. The war in China, grinding on since 1937, had consumed enormous Japanese resources without producing the decisive victory that had been promised. By 1941, Japan had approximately 700,000 soldiers committed to China in a conflict that showed no sign of resolution. The military establishment had staked enormous prestige on the China campaign. Acknowledging it had been a strategic error was institutionally impossible. The occupation of French Indochina in July of 1941, which Japan undertook to establish bases closer to the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies, triggered a response from the United States that transformed the strategic situation. The Roosevelt administration froze Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed. Japan imported approximately 80% of its oil from the United States. Suddenly, gone. The choice that Japanese planners concluded they faced was this: accept American demands, which included withdrawal from China and French Indochina and abandonment of the territorial ambitions the military had pursued for a decade, or seize the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies by force, which meant going to war with Britain, the Netherlands, and almost certainly the United States as well. Continued negotiation was pursued in parallel with military planning through the autumn of 1941. But the military planning proceeded on a timeline that made the diplomatic option increasingly theoretical. The logic of the Pearl Harbor attack, within the framework of assumptions Japanese planners were operating under, was not entirely incoherent. The United States Pacific Fleet was the primary instrument that could interdict Japanese operations in the Western Pacific. Destroying it in a single surprise attack would buy the time needed to seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and a perimeter of island fortifications. The cost of dislodging Japan from its new empire would seem prohibitive to an American public that Japanese planners believed lacked the stomach for a long war. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, was not among those who believed this assessment. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and traveled widely in America. He understood, at a level many of his colleagues did not, the industrial and human capacity the United States would bring to a war it chose to fight with full commitment. According to accounts recorded after the war by Japanese officers who served under him, Yamamoto expressed serious reservations about the long-term prospects of a conflict with the United States, believing Japan could achieve early successes but doubting the empire's ability to sustain a prolonged war against American industrial power. He was right about the timeline. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941 achieved tactical surprise with a completeness that exceeded the expectations of its planners. The first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft arrived over the harbor at 7:48 in the morning. The second wave of 171 aircraft followed approximately an hour later. In the space of 2 hours, the attack sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed approximately 340 American aircraft, killed 2,403 Americans, and wounded approximately 1,200 more. The material damage was severe. The psychological impact in Japan was intoxicating. The strategic result was the opposite of what the attack was designed to achieve. The 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were not in port on December 7th. The Enterprise and the Lexington were at sea delivering aircraft to Wake Island and Midway. The Saratoga was undergoing repair on the West Coast. The Pearl Harbor attack had been designed around the assumption that aircraft carriers and battleships were roughly equivalent naval assets. Within the following year, every significant naval engagement in the Pacific would demonstrate that they were not. The aircraft carrier had rendered the battleship strategically obsolete. Japan had sunk the assets that no longer mattered and missed the ones that did. The oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, containing approximately 4.5 million barrels of fuel, were not attacked. Admiral Nagumo decided against a third strike wave, partly from concern about his aircraft's fuel state and partly from a conservative instinct to preserve his carrier force after the extraordinary success of the first two waves. The oil that remained in those tanks sustained American Pacific operations for months. Had it been destroyed, the timeline of American recovery would have extended significantly. The American public's response to Pearl Harbor was exactly what Yamamoto had feared. The attack that was intended to shock the United States into accepting the reality of Japanese power instead produced a unity of purpose and a commitment to total war that erased the domestic political divisions that had constrained Roosevelt's foreign policy for years. The isolationist movement, a genuine and powerful force in American politics through the 1930s, essentially ceased to exist as a significant political factor within days of the attack. Hitler, honoring the tripartite pact linking Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, declared war on the United States on December 11th. It was a decision he made apparently without serious strategic calculation, under the assumption that the United States was already effectively at war with Germany through its support for Britain and the Soviet Union, and that a formal declaration changed little. It changed everything. It removed the last legal and political constraint on full American engagement in the European war, and gave Roosevelt the authority to pursue the Europe First strategy that American and British military planners had already agreed upon. The weeks and months that followed Pearl Harbor in the Pacific produced a succession of catastrophes for Allied forces that demonstrated the full operational reach of Japanese military power. The British position at Singapore, which Churchill had described as an impregnable bastion, fell to Japanese forces on February 15th of 1942. According to British military records, approximately 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered to a Japanese force that was numerically smaller and had advanced down the Malay Peninsula in 68 days through terrain British planners had classified as impassable for a major military force. Churchill later called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore exposed the hollowness of the claim that European colonial power in Asia was a permanent feature of the international order. If the most heavily defended British position in Asia could fall in less than 70 days to an Asian army, the assumptions on which British, French, and Dutch colonial authority rested were demonstrably false. The political consequences of that demonstration would unfold across the following 2 decades as Asia remade its relationship with European colonialism. The Japanese advance seemed, in the spring of 1942, to confirm the most optimistic Japanese strategic projections. The perimeter that had been planned was being established on schedule and at lower cost than anticipated. The resource base that the entire strategic plan had been designed to secure was in Japanese hands. Then came the battle that changed everything. The Battle of Midway, fought on June 4th through 7th of 1942, is one of the most analyzed naval battles in history, partly because of the dramatic completeness of its outcome, partly because that outcome hinged on decisions and chance events compressed into a few minutes on the morning of June 4th that reshaped the entire Pacific War. American cryptanalysts had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to know that Midway was the target, and approximately when the attack would come, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, which had been hastily repaired after damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea, to intercept the Japanese force. The 4 Japanese carriers were caught at the worst possible moment. Japanese aircraft returning from strikes on Midway needed to land and refuel. Aircraft being prepared for a strike against the American carriers were below decks being rearmed. The flight decks were crowded with fuel lines and ordnance. American dive bombers arrived in their attack dives within a 5-minute window that found the Japanese carriers in exactly this configuration. Within approximately 5 minutes of concentrated dive bombing, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were fatally damaged and burning. The 4th survived to launch strikes that damaged the Yorktown, which later sank, before being destroyed in a subsequent American strike. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 experienced aircrew, including a significant proportion of the most skilled naval aviators in the world, men whose expertise could not be rapidly replaced. The United States lost 1 carrier and approximately 150 aircraft. Midway did not end the Pacific War. More than 3 years of brutal fighting remained, but it eliminated the offensive capability that had made Japanese expansion possible and shifted the strategic initiative in the Pacific to the United States in a way that subsequent battles would confirm but never reverse. The empire had been built on the assumption that early victories would create a defensive perimeter costly enough to deter American counterattack. The perimeter existed. The deterrence did not. The United States was fully mobilized, converting its industrial capacity to military production at rates that were already dwarfing Japanese output and would increasingly dominate every material calculation of the war. The question was no longer whether Japan could win. It was how long the empire could hold, and at what cost to both sides the eventual reckoning would come. Chapter 8. The Holocaust History's Darkest Chapter. Picture a street in Amsterdam in the summer of 1942. A 13-year-old girl sits at a desk near the window of the apartment where her family has been hiding for weeks. Outside, she can hear the city going about its day. Trams, voices, the ordinary sounds of a world continuing without her. She opens a diary and begins to write, not because she believes anyone will ever read it, but because writing is the only way she knows to hold on to the person she is still trying to become. Her name is Anne Frank, and the world she is being erased from is the same world that produced Beethoven and Goethe and some of the most sophisticated democratic institutions in European history. That is the beginning of the answer to the question that sits at the center of Holocaust history. Not the question of what happened. The historical record of what happened is among the most thoroughly documented in the history of human atrocity. Established through German bureaucratic records, trial testimony, survivor accounts, physical evidence, and decades of rigorous scholarship. The question that is harder, and that matters more for understanding how it was possible, is the question of how. Not how in the mechanical sense of methods and logistics. How in the human sense. How did a modern industrial nation, in the middle of the 20th century, organize and execute the systematic murder of 6 million people while millions of others watched, participated, looked away, or simply went about their daily lives? The answer that historians have spent decades constructing is more uncomfortable than the simpler answer most people prefer. The simpler answer locates the Holocaust in the specific madness of Adolf Hitler and a small circle of ideological fanatics who imposed their pathology on a nation that was essentially their victim. This answer is not entirely wrong. Hitler's ideological obsession with the destruction of European Jewry was real and central. Without it, the Holocaust as it occurred does not happen. But it is not enough. The historian Christopher Browning, in his meticulous study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, published in 1992, documented something that complicates the simple answer considerably. The men of that battalion were ordinary middle-aged German policemen from Hamburg, not members of the SS, not selected for ideological fanaticism. Yet, they killed approximately 38,000 Jews and deported approximately 45,000 more to the death camps. Their commanding officer explicitly told them at the outset that those who did not wish to participate could be reassigned without penalty. Very few asked to be reassigned. Browning's conclusion, which generated significant scholarly debate, including a direct challenge from the historian Daniel Goldhagen, is that the men of the battalion killed primarily because of a combination of conformity, careerism, peer pressure, and the psychological mechanisms of obedience that human beings display in institutional contexts. The debate between Browning and Goldhagen has not been fully resolved, and probably cannot be, because the motivations of individuals participating in mass atrocity are multiple, varied, and resist single explanations. What both historians agree on is something more important than the specific balance of factors. The Holocaust required the participation of enormous numbers of ordinary people: German soldiers, policemen, railway workers, civil servants, businessmen, doctors, lawyers, and neighbors, people who went home at night to their families, people who celebrated birthdays and worried about their children's schooling and had opinions about the weather. The industrialization of murder on the scale the Holocaust required could not have been accomplished by fanatics alone. It required the cooperation, active or passive, of a society. The path to that cooperation was neither sudden nor hidden. It was built in public, incrementally, over a decade, in ways that each step normalized the next. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had defined Jews as a racial category outside the national community. The progressive exclusion from professions, from public spaces, from schools, from civic life had reduced Jewish Germans from fellow citizens to visible outsiders. Kristallnacht in 1938 had demonstrated that organized violence against Jews would produce no meaningful legal consequence. Each step made the next step easier to take. The decision to move from persecution to systematic extermination did not occur at a single moment or through a single order. Historians, including Christopher Browning and Ian Kershaw, in his definitive 2-volume biography of Hitler, tend toward a position in which the ideological goal of eliminating Jews from Europe was constant, but the specific decision to pursue that goal through systematic physical extermination evolved through stages during 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 marks the threshold that most historians identify as the beginning of the Holocaust in its full genocidal form. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing units organized into 4 groups that followed the advancing army, were tasked with killing all Jewish men of military age. Within weeks, their operations expanded to include women and children. The scale of these killings was documented in reports sent to Berlin with bureaucratic regularity, recording body counts with the matter-of-fact precision of administrative correspondence. By December of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed approximately 500,000 Soviet Jews. By the end of the war, they and associated units had killed approximately 1.5 million people, the vast majority of them Jewish. In the ravine of Babi Yar, outside Kiev, over September 29th and 30th of 1941, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were marched to the edge and shot. That figure comes from the Einsatzgruppen's own operational report filed with Berlin. The operation was completed in 2 days. It was one of hundreds of similar operations conducted across the occupied Soviet territories. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th of 1942, attended by 15 senior Nazi officials, including Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, did not decide to exterminate European Jews. That decision had already been made and was already being implemented. What Wannsee did was coordinate the bureaucratic machinery of different government departments behind a program now to be extended to the entirety of European Jewry under German control. Approximately 11 million people by the conference's own demographic calculations. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference survived the war and were introduced as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. They are among the most chilling documents in human history, precisely because of their tone. The murder of millions of people discussed in the language of administrative planning. Euphemisms deployed throughout. The word evacuation appearing where extermination is meant. The language of bureaucratic procedure applied to genocide with the same unreflective professionalism that any government official might bring to a routine policy coordination meeting. Read that again. Routine policy coordination. The physical infrastructure of industrial killing was developed and expanded through 1942. The camps built specifically for mass killing. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the largest of all, Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland, were factories of death, designed for the efficient killing of large numbers of people arriving by train from across occupied Europe. Auschwitz-Birkenau combined a concentration camp, a forced labor camp, and 4 large gas chamber and crematorium complexes. The historian Deborah Lipstadt summarizes the physical evidence from Auschwitz as among the most thoroughly documented crime scenes in history. The blueprints for the crematoria, the testimony of survivors, the confessions of perpetrators at post-war trials, and the physical remains of the facilities all document with precision the scale and method of the killing. Deportations of Jews from across German-occupied Europe proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Jews from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Hungary, and dozens of other occupied or allied territories were transported east by rail, processed at the camps, and in the majority of cases, killed immediately upon arrival if they were deemed unable to provide useful labor. Children, the elderly, the sick, directly from the trains to the gas chambers. The experience of arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau was described by survivors in terms that strained the capacity of language to convey. The platform, the lights, the selection, in which an SS doctor directed new arrivals with a gesture to the right toward the camp and temporary survival, or to the left toward immediate death. Families separated in those seconds who never saw each other again. The Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to operate the crematoria under threat of death. Left accounts and hidden documents discovered after the war. Some buried their words near the crematoria, knowing they were likely to be killed before liberation and wanting their testimony to survive them. They buried their words in the ground so that someone, someday, would know. The question of what the Allies knew and when they knew it has generated one of the most sustained debates in Holocaust historiography. By 1942, the broad outlines of the extermination program were available to Allied intelligence through multiple sources, including reports from the Polish underground, escaped prisoners, and the decryption of German police radio traffic being read at Bletchley Park. The historian Richard Breitman, in his study published in 1998, documents the specific information available to British and American decision-makers and the largely inadequate responses it generated. The specific question of whether the Allies should have bombed the railway lines leading to Auschwitz-Birkenau has been examined in technical detail by military historians and aviation analysts. By the summer of 1944, American heavy bombers were striking industrial targets in the region of Auschwitz. Aerial photographs taken on reconnaissance missions show the Birkenau crematoria visible in the background. The decision not to bomb the railways or the crematoria was made and remade when pressed by officials who argued that military resources should be directed at military targets and that bombing the camps would disrupt but not stop the killing while potentially killing prisoners. The counterargument is that even a temporary disruption of the deportation railways in the summer of 1944, when Hungarian Jews were being transported to Auschwitz at rates of up to 12,000 per day, would have saved lives on a scale that the military cost of the bombing raids would not have approached. The debate has not produced a final answer that satisfies all parties. It probably never will. The total death toll of the Holocaust is established by institutions, including Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, at approximately 6 million Jewish victims. This figure represents approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe at the time. 1/3 of the world's Jewish population was murdered between 1941 and 1945. The Holocaust also killed millions of others. Soviet prisoners of war in numbers approaching 3 million. Polish civilians in the millions. Roma people, with estimates between 500,000 and 1.5 million killed. Disabled people murdered in the Action Tor euthanasia program. Gay men. Jehovah's Witnesses. Political prisoners. The perpetrators were tried at Nuremberg, and in subsequent proceedings, some were executed. Many received sentences that were reduced or not fully served. Many others returned to civilian life in post-war Germany and faced no formal accountability at all. Anne Frank was discovered in her hiding place in August of 1944. She died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in February of 1945. Approximately 2 months before the camp was liberated, she was 15 years old. Her diary survived. What the Holocaust ultimately demands of everyone who studies it is not just knowledge of what happened, something harder. A genuine confrontation with the question of what it means that this was not the work of monsters from another species. It was the work of people living inside systems, institution, and social pressures that diffused individual moral responsibility until each person could tell themselves that what they were doing was manageable, necessary, or simply not their decision. The conditions that made it possible, the incremental normalization of exclusion, the bureaucratic diffusion of moral responsibility, the human capacity for obedience in institutional contexts, the power of propaganda to define categories of people as less than fully human. These are not conditions specific to 1930s Germany. They are conditions that recur. They have recurred since. They continue to recur. That is the most important thing to understand about the Holocaust. And it is the most difficult. Chapter 9. Turning Points. Stalingrad. El Alamein. Guadalcanal. In the late autumn of 1942, a Soviet soldier named Yakov Pavlov led a small group of men into a 4-story apartment building in the ruined city of Stalingrad and held it against German attack for 58 days. 58 days. The building, which became known as Pavlov's house, was defended by approximately 25 soldiers from more than 10 different Soviet nationalities. They dug anti-tank ditches around it. They mined the approaches. They punched holes through the internal walls so they could move between floors without exposing themselves to fire from outside. When German attackers came, they came repeatedly and they came in force. And every time, the building held. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army besieging Stalingrad, reportedly noted that more German soldiers died trying to take that single building than died capturing the entire city of Paris in 1940. That building, those 25 men, that is what the Battle of Stalingrad was. Not a story of armies and maneuver and the clean geometry of military maps. A story of human beings refusing to give up the ground beneath their feet when giving up that ground felt like giving up everything. The German summer offensive of 1942, Operation Blue, had driven southeast toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga River. Hitler divided the attacking force between two objectives: the oil fields to the south and Stalingrad to the east. A division that stretched German logistics to the limit and concentrated insufficient force at either point to achieve decisive results quickly. Stalingrad became the focus of the German effort, not primarily for military reasons, but for symbolic ones. The city bore Stalin's name. Hitler had decided it must be taken. Stalin had decided it must not be surrendered. These symmetrical political imperatives transformed what might have been a militarily rational decision about a Volga crossing point into an existential struggle that consumed both armies. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August of 1942 and began a campaign of urban fighting that lasted through September, October, and November. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army defending the city, developed a tactical response that has been analyzed by military historians ever since. Chuikov's forces deliberately maintained contact with the German lines at distances so close that the Luftwaffe could not provide air support without risking German casualties. They contested every building, every floor, every room. German soldiers named the individual ruins with dark humor that reflected the surreal nature of fighting that measured progress in meters over days of combat. Soviet defenders sometimes held single floors or stairwells for days against repeated attacks. Both sides fed soldiers into the city at a rate that consumed divisions in weeks. But what neither the German soldiers fighting in the ruins nor their commanding officers fully understood through the autumn was that Soviet planning had moved far beyond the battle for Stalingrad itself. Operation Uranus, launched on November 19th of 1942, struck not at the German forces in Stalingrad, but at the flanks of the salient that Stalingrad had created in the German line. Those flanks were held by Romanian and Italian armies, whose equipment and morale were significantly inferior to German standards, and who had been reporting their vulnerability to German headquarters for months without receiving adequate reinforcement. Soviet armored forces broke through the Romanian positions, north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, and linked up at Kalach on November 23rd. Encircling the entire German Sixth Army of approximately 300,000 men, the trap closed in a single day. Hitler forbade any breakout attempt. Paulus was promoted to field marshal, partly in the hope that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. He was ordered to hold the pocket and wait for a relief force. Hermann Göring had promised the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. The actual supply deliveries averaged approximately 100 tons per day against a stated minimum requirement of 500 tons. The men of the Sixth Army froze, starved, and died through December and January at a rate the air supply could not remotely address. The German relief attempt came closest to reaching the pocket in mid-December, but was stopped approximately 48 kilometers short when Soviet forces launched a new offensive, threatening to collapse the entire German Southern Front. The choice was between rescuing the Sixth Army and preventing a catastrophe that would have dwarfed even Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was abandoned. Paulus surrendered on January 31st of 1943. His staff surrendered on February 2nd. Approximately 91,000 surviving German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Of those 91,000, approximately 6,000 survived to return to Germany after the war, most of them years after the fighting ended. The rest died in captivity. 3 days of national mourning were declared in Nazi Germany. For many Germans, Stalingrad represented the first crack in public confidence that German victory was ultimately certain. The confidence that Nazi propaganda had maintained through years of genuine military success had fractured. It would never fully recover. In the desert of northern Egypt, a different kind of turning point was being prepared. General Bernard Montgomery, who had taken command of the British Eighth Army in August of 1942, refused to attack until he had overwhelming superiority in men, equipment, and supply. He prepared his forces with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He was not going to rush into a battle he might lose to satisfy Churchill's impatience for results. Churchill desperately needed a victory. Montgomery was going to give him one he could keep. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23rd of 1942, was a grinding, methodical battle that lasted 12 days. Montgomery attacked with approximately 230,000 men against a German and Italian force of approximately 116,000. The British had approximately 1,100 tanks against approximately 500 Axis tanks, and air superiority that disrupted German supply lines throughout the battle. Erwin Rommel, commanding the Axis forces, was in Germany receiving medical treatment when the battle began. He flew back to take command of a defense already under severe pressure. His operational skill partially compensated for the material inferiority, but the arithmetic of the battle was working against him in a way that could not be reversed. German and Italian forces broke on November 4th. The long retreat began. Churchill said of El Alamein that it was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but it was, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The formulation captured something real. Britain had demonstrated it could defeat German forces in a conventional engagement when properly equipped, adequately supplied, and competently led. After years of retreat, that demonstration was worth more than its military effects alone. In the Pacific, the struggle for Guadalcanal told its own version of the same story in conditions as different from the North African desert as could be imagined. American Marines had landed on the island on August 7th of 1942 to seize an airfield the Japanese were constructing. The campaign that followed lasted 6 months and consumed both sides in jungle fighting, naval battles, and air combat that tested American endurance beyond almost anything they had experienced. The jungle was so dense that units lost contact with each other at distances measured in tens of meters. Disease, primarily malaria, but also dysentery, dengue fever, and fungal infections, incapacitated soldiers at rates that often exceeded combat casualties. Men fought in conditions that their training had prepared them for in outline, but not in the visceral reality of sustained jungle warfare, where the environment itself was a continuous drain on physical and psychological reserves. 7 major naval battles were fought in the waters around the island. The Americans lost more ships than the Japanese in the early battles. The waters acquired the name Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships from both sides lying on its floor. But the resource competition was one that Japan's overall strategic situation made unsustainable. Every ship, aircraft, and soldier committed to Guadalcanal was a resource not available elsewhere. Every loss was a loss that Japanese production could not replace at the rate American production was replacing American losses. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February of 1943 removed approximately 13,000 surviving soldiers from the island. The American victory was confirmed. 3 campaigns, 3 continents, 3 Axis defeats. The convergence of Stalingrad, El Alamein, and Guadalcanal in the same brief period reflected the same underlying reality beginning to express itself across multiple theaters simultaneously. The material advantage of the Allied coalition was becoming large enough to overcome tactical inferiority in specific engagements. The side that could replace its losses faster than its opponent could inflict them was beginning to assert itself. After the autumn of 1942, the Axis powers never again held the strategic initiative on any front. They fought with increasing effectiveness and at enormous cost to their opponents. But they fought from that point forward on the defensive, responding to Allied pressure rather than creating it. The turning point was real. The war was far from over. But what had changed was something military historians describe as the operational initiative. The capacity to choose when and where to fight rather than responding to an opponent's choices. After the autumn of 1942, that initiative belonged to the Allies. They would not always use it wisely, but they would never permanently lose it again. Chapter 10. The Alliance That Won the War. In the autumn of 1942, a young Soviet factory worker named Sasha was operating a lathe in a building that had no roof. The roof had not been destroyed by bombing. It had never been built. The factory, one of the industrial enterprises relocated east of the Urals at the beginning of the German invasion, had been reassembled so quickly that getting the machines running took priority over everything else. Workers operated their equipment in temperatures that fell below freezing in winter. They slept on cots between the machines because there was no housing to go home to. They ate what the state rationing system provided, which was not enough, and worked shifts that left almost no time for anything except the next shift. What they produced went directly to the front. The tanks and artillery and aircraft that Soviet forces used to close the trap at Stalingrad were built by people like Sasha. In buildings like that factory, sustained in part by food and equipment that had traveled thousands of miles from American ports through the North Atlantic under German submarine attack. That is the material reality of the alliance that won the Second World War. Not the photographs of 3 men sitting in a row at Tehran. Not the communiques issued after summit meetings. The actual substance of the alliance was workers operating lathes under open skies in Siberian winter, and American merchant sailors running convoys through waters where submarines were hunting them, and British factory workers turning out aircraft components through the years when German bombs were still falling on their cities. The alliance worked because necessity made it work, and understanding what it actually required and what it cost is essential to understanding both the victory and the world the victory produced. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin were the public faces of the alliance. They met 3 times as a group. At Tehran in November of 1943, at Yalta in February of 1945, and the final incomplete gathering at Potsdam after Roosevelt's death in April of 1945, when Harry Truman had replaced him. Between those meetings, the alliance was maintained through a continuous flow of diplomatic correspondence, military staff coordination, and the practical business of keeping the material lifeline of Lend-Lease functioning. These three men distrusted each other in ways that were specific, well-founded, and never fully resolved. Churchill had been among the most vocal Western opponents of Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution. Stalin operated on the assumption that Churchill's ultimate interest was in a Europe exhausted by German-Soviet conflict that left British power intact and both continental rivals weakened. Roosevelt believed that personal engagement with Stalin could produce genuine cooperation in the post-war world, a conviction that some of his advisors considered naive and that subsequent events complicated. The numbers behind the mutual suspicion were real and significant. By the time the Western Allies landed in Normandy in June of 1944, the Soviet Union had been bearing the principal weight of the land war against Germany for 3 years. Approximately 80% of all German military casualties in the Second World War were inflicted on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people in the war, a figure representing roughly 14% of the Soviet population. Churchill's consistent preference for operations in the Mediterranean, his reluctance to commit to a cross-channel invasion at the earliest possible date, could be interpreted, and was interpreted by Soviet planners, as a strategy that prolonged the period during which the Soviet Union bore the overwhelming burden of ground combat against Germany. Churchill genuinely believed that the Mediterranean operations were militarily necessary and that a premature cross-channel invasion would fail catastrophically. Stalin genuinely believed that the delay was costing Soviet lives that could have been saved. Both assessments contained real truth. The Lend-Lease program was one of the most significant practical contributions of the alliance and one of the most consistently underappreciated in popular history. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States provided the Soviet Union with approximately 17 million tons of equipment and supplies, including approximately 400,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives, nearly 15,000 aircraft, and enormous quantities of food, steel, aluminum, and communications equipment. Studies of Soviet wartime logistics, drawing on archival material opened after the Cold War, document the extent to which Soviet military operations depended on this support in ways that Soviet official history systematically minimized. American trucks moved Soviet armies. American communications equipment supported Soviet command and control. American food supplemented the diet of Soviet soldiers, whose own supply system was operating under severe strain. This is not to diminish the reality of Soviet military achievement, which was genuine and extraordinary. It is to recognize that the alliance functioned as a genuine system in which different components contributed different things, and that the outcome depended on all of them. The decision to invade northwestern France, finally confirmed at Tehran in November of 1943, was the alliance's most consequential operational agreement. Operation Overlord would take place in the spring of 1944. The commander would be an American, reflecting the reality that the United States was now providing the largest share of the men and material ups. Dwight David Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander in December of 1943. Eisenhower's qualifications for the job were not primarily those of a battlefield commander. His qualifications were those of a political military manager of extraordinary skill. He had a talent for building and maintaining coalitions of strong-willed, often difficult national commanders that the specific demands of commanding a multinational force made absolutely essential. He was exactly what the alliance needed at exactly the right moment. The Tehran Conference had also addressed the question of what would happen to Germany after its defeat. The discussion was preliminary and deliberately vague, but certain principles emerged that would shape everything that followed. Nazi Germany would be occupied by the Allied powers. Its leadership would face legal accountability. The Soviet Union would exercise significant influence over the countries of Eastern Europe that Soviet armies would liberate. Churchill, who was paying careful attention, was already worried. He understood, earlier and more clearly than Roosevelt, that the Soviet Union's position at the end of the war would give it effective control over an enormous swath of the continent, unless specific arrangements were made to constrain that control. His percentages agreement with Stalin in October of 1944, in which the two men divided southeastern European countries into spheres of influence with percentages written on a piece of paper, was an attempt to define and limit Soviet influence through old-fashioned power politics. Stalin signed the percentages agreement. He then proceeded to implement Soviet influence in Eastern Europe at a rate and to a degree that the agreement had no enforcement mechanism to prevent. The Yalta Conference of February of 1945 brought the Big Three together for the last time before Roosevelt's death. The agreements reached there on the occupation of Germany, the United Nations Organization, Soviet entry into the Pacific War against Japan, and the political future of Poland and Eastern Europe have been debated ever since. The historian S. M. Plokey, in his detailed study of the Yalta Conference, published in 2010, provides a nuanced assessment. Roosevelt's concessions reflected the military realities of February of 1945, in which Soviet armies already occupied most of Eastern Europe and the United States was facing the prospect of a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands that Soviet participation might shorten significantly. That the commitments made at Yalta were subsequently not honored was a political failure of the post-war period, not a strategic betrayal at Yalta. The alliance that won the Second World War was not built on trust. It was built on necessity. The common interest in defeating Nazi Germany was strong enough, and the cost of failing to maintain the alliance large enough, that the three governments found ways to navigate disagreements that would have been irreconcilable in any other context. That the same alliance began to fracture almost immediately after the common enemy was removed is not evidence that it was fraudulent. It is evidence that the common enemy was doing most of the work of holding it together, and that the interests it had temporarily subordinated were real and persistent. The Cold War did not represent a betrayal of the wartime alliance. It represented what the wartime alliance had always been underneath the photographs and the public declarations of unity. Three very different powers, with very different interests, that had found a common purpose strong enough to win a war and not quite strong enough to build a lasting peace. Chapter 11. Day and the Liberation of Europe. The men who crossed the English Channel in the early hours of June 6 of 1944 did not know they were participating in an event that would be studied and commemorated for generations. Most of them were thinking about considerably more immediate things. The water coming over the sides of the landing craft, the sound of aircraft overhead, the specific weight of the equipment they were carrying, which in some cases approached their own body weight. The men next to them. What was waiting on the beach? Approximately 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed to Normandy on June 6th. They landed on 5 beaches. Utah and Omaha were assigned to American forces, Gold and Sword to British forces, Juno to Canadian forces. 3 airborne divisions dropped in the hours before dawn to secure the flanks and prevent German armored forces from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours. The difference in experience between the 5 beaches was vast enough that soldiers who landed at Utah and soldiers who landed at Omaha might have been in different battles entirely. Utah Beach encountered relatively light resistance, approximately 200 casualties. Omaha Beach was something else entirely. The German defenders were experienced, well positioned in fortified bluffs overlooking the beach, and had not been neutralized by the preliminary bombardment supposed to destroy their positions before the landing craft arrived. The amphibious tanks designed to provide armored support were launched too far from shore in conditions too rough for them to survive, and most sank before reaching the beach. The infantry came ashore without armored support, under fire from positions above them, onto a beach with limited cover and obstacles that channeled movement into killing grounds. The German defenders had pre-registered with their weapons. The casualties at Omaha on June 6th were approximately 2,000 dead, wounded, and missing out of a landing force of approximately 34,000 men. The men who survived did so through a combination of training, improvisation, and what the historian Stephen Ambrose, in his detailed account of the Normandy campaign, published in 1994, describes as the initiative of small unit leaders who recognized that staying on the beach meant death and that the only survivable direction was forward and upward into the German positions. That upward movement, taken by sergeants and lieutenants, not waiting for orders that the chaos of the beach made impossible to transmit or receive, cleared enough of the bluffs above Omaha by late morning to make the beachhead viable. The German response to the landings reflected the strategic paralysis that the Allied deception operation had created at the highest levels of German command. Rommel had argued for months that armored reserves needed to be positioned close to the beaches, because once the Allies established a beachhead, their material advantage would make dislodging them increasingly impossible with every passing hour. He was right, and he was overruled. Hitler and the German High Command, convinced by the deception operation that Normandy was a feint with the real invasion coming at the Pas de Calais, held the most powerful armored reserves back for weeks. The divisions that could have driven the Allied forces off the beaches in the first 24 hours were waiting for an invasion that the Allies never intended to launch. By the time German commanders acknowledged that Normandy was the main effort, the Allied beachhead had grown large enough that the armored attack, which might have succeeded on June 6th, could no longer succeed. The campaign in Normandy, after the initial landing, settled into a grinding battle of attrition in the hedgerow country of the bocage. The hedgerows, ancient earth banks topped with dense vegetation dividing the Norman countryside into small fields, proved ideally suited to defensive warfare. German defenders could hold each hedgerow line with small forces that were difficult to dislodge. Allied progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day at enormous cost. The breakout came in late July with Operation Cobra. General Omar Bradley concentrated American forces and air power at a narrow point in the German line near St. Lo and attacked with a ferocity that punched through the defenses. General George Patton's newly activated Third Army exploited the opening with the aggressive mobile warfare Patton had trained his forces to execute. The German response, ordered by Hitler over the objections of his field commanders, was a counterattack at Morden that struck the flank of the American advance. It came close enough to cutting the American supply lines to cause genuine alarm at Allied headquarters. It also placed the attacking German forces in a position where they could be encircled. Allied forces closing from north and south created the Falaise Pocket, in which approximately 50 German divisions were trapped. The German army in France never recovered its coherence after Falaise. While the liberation of France proceeded with a speed that had seemed unimaginable in the grinding weeks of the bocage, a simultaneous offensive of even larger scale was transforming the Eastern Front in ways that Western memory of the war has consistently underweighted. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23 of 1944, the day after the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, struck the German Army Group Center along a front of approximately 1,200 kilometers. It destroyed 28 German divisions and severely damaged an additional 50. Army Group Center essentially ceased to exist as a coherent military force. Soviet forces advanced approximately 350 kilometers in 2 months. The near-simultaneous collapse of the German position in France and in Belarus left German strategy without a coherent response. The reserves that might have stabilized one front had been consumed in the other. Paris was liberated on August 25th of 1944. The images of French armored forces rolling through the streets, of crowds overwhelming the soldiers with celebration, of Charles de Gaulle walking down the Champs-Élysées the following day with a composure that was partly genuine courage and partly precisely calculated political theater, became among the defining images of the liberation of Western Europe. The attempt to end the war before the end of 1944, through Operation Market Garden in September, was Field Marshal Montgomery's most ambitious and most controversial operation. The plan called for 3 Allied airborne divisions to drop behind German lines in the Netherlands and seize a series of bridges, while armored forces drove north to link up with them and establish a bridgehead over the Rhine. The first 2 airborne objectives were secured. The third objective, the bridge at Arnhem, was one bridge too far. The British 1st Airborne Division landed too far from the bridge, encountered German armored forces that intelligence had failed to identify, and fought one of the most courageous defensive battles of the war for 9 days before being overwhelmed. Of approximately 10,000 British paratroopers who landed at Arnhem, approximately 2,000 escaped back to Allied lines. The failure of Market Garden meant the Rhine crossing that might have ended the war before the winter would have to wait for spring. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16th of 1944, was the largest land battle American forces fought in the entire war. The initial assault achieved genuine surprise against an American line that was thinly held. The first days produced a retreat that briefly threatened to unravel the Allied front in the sector. 2 American decisions in the first days proved decisive. The first was the refusal of the garrison of Bastogne to surrender. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and resupplied only by air, held against sustained German attack through 11 days of fighting in extreme cold. When the German commander demanded surrender, the American commander, Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word: "Notes." The second was Eisenhower's appointment of Patton to command the relief of Bastogne. Patton turned the Third Army 90 degrees from its existing line of advance, drove north through winter conditions that his own staff had said made the move impossible in the time frame he demanded, and broke through to Bastogne on December 26th. The Bulge consumed the German strategic reserve assembled for the offensive. When Allied forces resumed their advance in January of 1945, they faced a German army that had expended its last significant offensive capability. The Rhine crossings came in March. The link-up with Soviet forces on the Elbe came in April. Berlin fell to Soviet forces on May 2nd of 1945. Hitler died on April 30th in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Suicide by gunshot, according to the most reliable accounts. His body burned in the garden above, at his explicit instruction. He had been in the bunker since January, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed at their commanded strengths, convinced until the end that the alliance against him would break, that a separate peace was still possible, that the situation would somehow reverse itself if only the German people showed sufficient will. The German unconditional surrender was signed on May 8th of 1945. In the Soviet Union, where the time difference meant the surrender was officially received on May 9th. The date remains Victory Day, the most sacred secular holiday in the Russian calendar, marked every year with a military parade that carries within it the weight of 27 million dead. The liberation of Europe was complete. The cost had been staggering. The continent that had generated 2 world wars in 30 years lay in ruins. Its cities bombed, its economies destroyed, its populations exhausted and traumatized in ways that would take generations to even partially heal. And, on the other side of the world, in a different ocean and a different kind of war, the fighting continued. Chapter 12. The Pacific Endgame. There's a detail about the Battle of Iwo Jima that does not appear in most popular accounts, but that captures something essential about what the final phase of the Pacific War actually was. The island of Iwo Jima is approximately 21 square kilometers in area, roughly the size of a medium-sized city neighborhood. The Japanese garrison defending it numbered approximately 22,000 men. The American assault force numbered approximately 70,000 Marines. The battle lasted 36 days. American casualties totaled approximately 26,000, including nearly 7,000 dead. The Japanese garrison was almost entirely destroyed, with approximately 216 survivors taken prisoner. The mathematics of that battle tells you something that individual acts of courage cannot fully convey. The Pacific War in its final phase was not being won through superior tactics or superior fighting quality. It was being won through the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority against an opponent that had decided, at the institutional and cultural level, that surrender was not an acceptable outcome regardless of the military situation. The collision of those two realities produced a level of violence and destruction that still resists easy moral categorization. General Curtis LeMay, who took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January of 1945, switched from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude area bombing with incendiary weapons at night. The target was not specific industrial facilities. The target was the cities themselves. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th of 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in approximately 3 hours. 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. The death toll exceeded the immediate casualties of either atomic bomb dropped later that summer. Approximately 67 Japanese cities were subjected to similar raids over the following months. The total death toll from the conventional bombing campaign is estimated by historians, including Kenneth Werrell, at between 250,000 and 500,000 people, the majority of them civilians. The firebombing campaign is discussed less frequently than the atomic bombings in popular histories of the Pacific War. But in terms of total civilian casualties and physical destruction, the conventional bombing campaign was more destructive than the atomic bombs. The moral questions it raises about the deliberate targeting of civilian populations are at least as significant. The Battle of Okinawa, which lasted from April 1st to June 22nd of 1945, provided the data points that made invasion casualty estimates credible. The battle lasted 82 days and cost approximately 12,000 American deaths and approximately 110,000 Japanese military deaths. Okinawan civilian casualties are estimated between 40,000 and 150,000. A wide range that reflects the genuine difficulty historians face in separating combat deaths from civilian deaths when the fighting moved through populated areas and when some civilians were armed or coerced into resistance. American planners were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Scheduled to begin with the invasion of Kyushu in November of 1945, followed by the invasion of the main island of Honshu in March of 1946, The casualty estimates produced by American military planners for these operations varied significantly and have been the subject of historical debate. The figures that circulated at the highest levels of American decision-making ranged from several 100,000 American casualties to numbers exceeding 1 million, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially in the millions. The Japanese military had prepared for the invasion with a strategy that mobilized approximately 2.5 million regular military personnel and approximately 28 million civilian militia members for a final defense of the home islands. Approximately 5,000 kamikaze aircraft were being held in reserve. The willingness of Japanese military culture to embrace mass suicide as a tactic was not, from a Japanese perspective, irrational within the framework of values that Japanese military training and ideology had constructed. Surrender was not merely defeat. It was a form of moral annihilation so complete that death was genuinely preferable. This was not a performance. It was a value system that large numbers of Japanese soldiers and civilians had internalized completely enough to act on. The Manhattan Project, the American program to develop nuclear weapons, had been initiated in December of 1941 and eventually employed approximately 130,000 people. The scientific director was J. Robert Oppenheimer, working at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. The Trinity test, on July 16 of 1945, the first detonation of a nuclear device, produced a yield equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of TNT and demonstrated that the weapon worked. Oppenheimer, watching the explosion, later recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan was made by President Harry Truman, who had assumed the presidency on Roosevelt's death in April of 1945. The decision, and the ethical framework within which it was made, has been debated with extraordinary intensity ever since. And the evidence supports a genuine range of interpretations rather than a single definitive conclusion. Many historians, including Richard Frank, in his detailed study published in 1999, argue that Japan in the summer of 1945 was not unified around a decision to surrender on terms acceptable to the United States. The military faction that controlled Japanese decision-making was committed to fighting regardless of the human cost. The peace faction within the Japanese government lacked the institutional power to override military opposition without a shock so large that it bypassed the normal decision-making process entirely. Other historians, including Gar Alperovitz, in his revisionist account, published in 1995, argue that Japan was already moving toward surrender and that the atomic bombs were used with the additional goal of influencing the post-war strategic situation vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. The scholarly debate continues, reflecting genuine disagreement about the evidence rather than simple political preference. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6 of 1945 killed, by estimates that vary among researchers, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately, and a comparable or larger number from radiation and injuries in the following months. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9 produced similarly catastrophic immediate casualties. Between the two bombings, on August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, overwhelming the Kwantung Army. The combination of the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the Pacific War broke the political deadlock within the Japanese government. Emperor Hirohito intervened directly to break the deadlock within the Supreme Council and expressed his personal wish that Japan accept the Allied surrender terms. His radio address to the Japanese nation on August 15 of 1945 the first time ordinary Japanese people had ever heard the emperor's voice, announced the end of the war in language so indirect and formal that many listeners were not immediately certain what they had heard. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd of 1945 aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Pacific War had begun with a surprise attack on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. It ended in Tokyo Bay with signatures on paper. Between those two moments lay 4 years of warfare across thousands of miles of ocean, jungle, island, and city that killed enormous numbers of people across the entire Asian and Pacific region, with the full human cost distributed across Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, and many other populations whose suffering the Western focus on the American-Japanese conflict sometimes obscures in its full continental scale. The debate about the atomic bombs has not ended and almost certainly never will. What can be said with confidence is that the weapons ended the war faster than any alternative available to American decision-makers. That the immediate and long-term casualties were catastrophic, and that the use of nuclear weapons against civilian populations established a precedent whose implications the world has been living with ever since. The world that emerged from Tokyo Bay in September of 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the world that had existed in December of 1941. The reckoning for all of it was only beginning. Chapter 13. The Reckoning Trials, Ruins, and the New World Order. On the morning of November 20th of 1945, a man named Hans Frank sat in the dock at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg and stared at the American, British, French, and Soviet judges who were about to decide his fate. Frank had been the Governor General of occupied Poland. Under his authority, 3 million Polish Jews and millions of other Polish civilians had been killed. He had kept a diary throughout the war, 40 volumes of it, recording with bureaucratic precision the decisions and events of an administration built on systematic murder. When the Allied prosecutors entered those diaries into evidence, they did not need to construct a case from inference and testimony alone. They had his own words. Frank had recently converted to Catholicism. He told the court he was grateful for the trial, that it was a necessary act of justice. Whether that was genuine remorse or the calculation of a man hoping that contrition might spare his life was impossible to determine from the outside. The court sentenced him to death. He was hanged on October 16th of 1946, along with 10 other defendants. The Nuremberg trials, which lasted from November of 1945 to October of 1946 for the main proceedings, and continued through subsequent trials into 1949, have been simultaneously praised as the foundation of modern international criminal law and criticized as victor's justice, a proceeding in which the winning powers judged the losing ones by standards the judges themselves had not always met. Both assessments contained genuine truth. The trials were conducted by powers that had themselves engaged in the area bombing of civilian populations, that had interned civilian populations of Japanese descent without due process, and that included the Soviet Union, whose own crimes against civilian populations during the war were not subjects of the proceedings. The procedural standards were not identical to those of established domestic criminal courts in the participating countries. And yet, the alternative to imperfect justice was not perfect justice. It was the absence of any legal accountability at all. The principle that individuals, including heads of state and senior military commanders, could be held personally accountable under international law for the decision to wage aggressive war and for the commission of atrocities against civilian populations was genuinely new and genuinely important. It created a legal framework. however imperfect in its initial application, that subsequent decades would build on, extend, and eventually institutionalize in the International Criminal Court, established in 2002. Outside the courtroom, the physical landscape of Europe and Asia in the aftermath of the war defied comprehensive description. Germany lay in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its infrastructure destroyed, its approximately 70 million people divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The German economy had essentially ceased to function. Millions of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, former slave laborers, prisoners of war, and civilian refugees from territories reassigned by the post-war settlement were moving across a shattered continent looking for safety, food, and some remnant of the lives they had lost. The scale of population displacement in Europe in 1945 and 1946 was without precedent in the continent's history. Approximately 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries in what the Potsdam Agreement described as orderly and humane transfers, a description that the actual conduct of the expulsions frequently did not match. The Potsdam Conference of July and August of 1945, attended by Truman, Stalin, and, initially, Churchill, who was replaced mid-conference by the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee when the Labour Party won the British general election, confirmed the division of Germany into occupation zones, established the framework for the denazification and demilitarization of Germany, and set the conditions for the post-war territorial settlement. What Potsdam did not resolve, and what became increasingly clear in the months following, was the fundamental incompatibility between Soviet and Western visions of what post-war Europe should look like. The Soviet Union was absolutely committed to ensuring that the countries on its western border were governed by regimes that were either Soviet-controlled or reliably subordinate to Soviet interests. The governments that Soviet forces installed across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Soviet zone of Germany were not democratic in any meaningful sense. The Western Allies protested. The protests had no enforcement mechanism that did not risk military conflict with the Soviet Union, which nobody was prepared to contemplate. The Iron Curtain, the phrase Churchill used in his speech at Fulton, Missouri, in March of 1946, was not a diplomatic construction. It was a description of a reality already in place. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in June of 1947, offered American economic aid for the reconstruction of European economies. Stalin refused the offer for the Soviet Union and pressured Eastern European governments to refuse it as well. The countries of Western Europe accepted. The approximately $13 billion of American economic aid that flowed to them over 4 years provided the foundation for the economic recovery that transformed Western Europe from ruins to prosperity with a speed that astonished contemporary observers. The Marshall Plan was simultaneously an act of economic generosity, a strategic investment in the stability of Western European democracies, and the beginning of an economic integration process that would eventually produce the European Union. The United Nations, whose founding charter had been drafted at the San Francisco Conference in April and June of 1945, was the institutional embodiment of the hope that the war had generated for a new international order capable of preventing a third. The Security Council, with its 5 permanent members and their veto powers, institutionalized the great power politics that the League of Nations had tried to transcend. The General Assembly provided a forum where all nations had a voice. The UN was not the world government that some post-war planners had dreamed of. It was something more realistic, and in some ways more durable. An institution that provided a forum for negotiation, a framework for collective action when the great powers agreed, and a source of international legitimacy for decisions that individual states could not legitimately make unilaterally. The atomic bomb, whose use had ended the Pacific War, had also created a new and permanent condition for international relations. The Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear weapon in August of 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima, years earlier than American intelligence had estimated was possible. The nuclear monopoly lasted less than 4 years. The world had entered the nuclear age. The specific character of the Cold War that followed, the decades of ideological competition, proxy conflicts, arms races, and the permanent shadow of nuclear annihilation, was in significant part a product of the way the Second World War ended. The war had created 2 superpowers and exhausted everyone else. It had placed those 2 superpowers in physical contact across the center of Europe with incompatible ideological systems and incompatible security requirements. It had given both of them weapons capable of ending human civilization. The long peace between the major powers that followed was not the world the victors had intended to create. It was the world that the specific combination of wartime decisions, wartime geography, and wartime technology had made. Chapter 14. Legacy. What kind of world did the war make? Here is a test you can run right now. Wherever you are in the world, look around you. The political institutions that govern your country, the international organizations that shape the rules of global trade and conflict, the borders of most nations on the map, the nuclear arsenals whose existence constrains what major powers do to each other, the legal frameworks that define crimes against humanity and the rights of individuals against their own governments, the economic integration that has given Western Europe the longest period of peace in its recorded history. Virtually every structural feature of the world you live in was shaped in fundamental ways by the Second World War and the decisions made in its immediate aftermath. This is not a metaphor. It is a concrete description of how the current world was made. The decolonization that swept Asia and Africa in the 2 decades after 1945 was not coincidental with the war's outcome. It was caused by it. The Japanese conquest of European colonial territories in Southeast Asia had demonstrated to the populations of those territories that European military supremacy was not a natural fact, but a contingent condition that had just been decisively disproven. When European powers attempted to re-establish their colonial authority after the war, they found themselves facing independence movements strengthened by wartime experience. Operating in a post-war international environment in which the United States was not a reliable supporter of European imperial restoration, India achieved independence in August of 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan in a division whose violence killed, by various scholarly estimates, between several 100,000 and over 1 million people in the communal massacres that accompanied the boundary drawing. The timing of independence was accelerated by a Britain economically and politically exhausted by 6 years of total war. The French attempt to re-establish authority in Indochina produced a war that France eventually lost at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a defeat that led directly to the American involvement in Vietnam that dominated the following 2 decades of American foreign policy. The establishment of the State of Israel in May of 1948 was shaped fundamentally by the Holocaust, both as a political argument for Jewish statehood that the world's post-war guilt made difficult to refuse, and as a demographic reality in which hundreds of thousands of survivors needed somewhere to go. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, was a direct consequence of the wartime decision to divide the Korean peninsula between Soviet and American occupation zones, a division intended as a temporary administrative arrangement that became permanent when the two occupation zones hardened into two incompatible states. Korea remains divided more than 70 years later. One of the most direct surviving consequences of wartime decisions, whose full implications their makers did not anticipate, Nazi Germany, the state that launched the European War, was rebuilt as two separate states that embodied the Cold War division of Europe. West Germany built one of the most successful democratic systems and one of the most prosperous economies in the world, while constructing a relationship with its own recent past through legal accountability, education, and memorialization that became one of the more serious national efforts at historical reckoning that the 20th century produced. East Germany built a secret police apparatus of extraordinary reach and constructed a physical wall through the center of Berlin in 1961 to prevent its own population from leaving. The wall stood until November of 1989, when it was torn down by crowds whose celebration was watched live on television across the world. Germany was reunified in October of 1990, 45 years after its defeat, as a stable democracy at the center of European integration. The European Union, which had its origins in the coal and steel integration agreements of the early 1950s, was explicitly conceived by its founders as a mechanism for making another European war impossible, by making European economies so deeply integrated that the cost of conflict between members would be prohibitive. Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, and the other architects of European integration were not naive idealists. They were practical people who had lived through both world wars and who understood that the specific mechanism that had produced both needed to be structurally altered rather than simply politically managed. The European project has been contested, imperfect, and frequently criticized. What it has unambiguously achieved is the longest period without major interstate war in Western European history in at least 3 centuries. For a continent that generated the two most destructive wars in human history within 25 years of each other, that achievement deserves more recognition than the routine political debates about European institutions typically generate. The legal concept of genocide, defined and named by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who lost 49 members of his own family in the Holocaust, was incorporated into international law through the Genocide Convention of 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 10th of 1948, represented a claim that individual human beings had rights that existed independently of the states that governed them, and that the international community had both the standing and the obligation to insist on those rights. These were genuinely new ideas in international law, not because the underlying moral principles were new, but because the institutional embodiment of those principles at the international level was new. Whether they have worked is a question that the subsequent history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and mass atrocity from Cambodia to Rwanda to Bosnia to Darfur answers with painful honesty. The legal framework created in response to the Holocaust has not prevented subsequent atrocities. It has provided a basis for accountability, for intervention debates, for the construction of international criminal tribunals, and for a moral vocabulary of condemnation that, however inadequate to the scale of subsequent violence, is meaningfully different from the absence of any such framework. Now let the full weight of this history settle. 70 to 85 million people dead. Cities erased. The deliberate murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in an act of industrialized genocide that challenged every comfortable assumption about what modern civilization was capable of producing. The development and use of weapons capable of ending human civilization. The division of the world into competing ideological blocks, whose confrontation shaped every dimension of international life for nearly half a century. This is what the decisions of the 1930s made possible. This is where the accumulated weight of a punitive peace treaty, a catastrophic depression, a failure of collective security, and the ordinary human tendency to prioritize the pressures of today over the consequences of tomorrow, eventually arrived. And yet, the same war that produced those catastrophes also produced the institutional architecture that has prevented a Third World War for nearly 80 years. It produced the decolonization of Asia and Africa. It produced the legal frameworks that hold individuals accountable across national borders. It produced the European integration that transformed the most war-prone region in modern history into a zone of durable peace. This is not a comfortable balance sheet. The costs on one side are too staggering for any ledger of benefits to fully offset them. But it is an honest one. The spine question this documentary began with was whether the Second World War was inevitable, or whether it was a series of moments where history could have gone differently. The honest answer is that it was both, in a way that the either-or framing cannot capture. The specific conditions that made the war possible were not inevitable outcomes of forces too large for human agency to affect. They were the products of decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances that could have been made differently. A less punitive peace, a more resilient international institution, a clearer-eyed response to aggression at any one of a dozen early moments. Any of these might have sent history somewhere else. But the forces that made those decisions likely, the exhaustion and fear and miscalculation that pervaded the post-war world, the political pressures that constrained what statesmen could do even when they understood the stakes. These were not minor obstacles that better individual decision-making could easily have overcome. They were structural features of the political and economic world that the First World War had created. What the war demands of anyone who studies it seriously is not a verdict about whether it was inevitable, but something harder. A genuine reckoning with the specific ways that ordinary human decision-making, operating under the pressures of the specific moment, produced an outcome of extraordinary catastrophe, not because the people making those decisions were monsters, though some of them were, but because the gap between what the moment required and what most human beings are capable of delivering when the pressures are immediate and the consequences are abstract and future is a permanent feature of how human societies make decisions. That gap has not closed. It is visible in the ways that contemporary democracies struggle with long-term threats that require short-term costs. It is visible in the ways that international institutions designed to prevent collective failures prove inadequate when national interests diverge sharply enough. It is visible in the persistence of ideological extremism, the scapegoating of minorities, the appeal of authoritarian certainty in conditions of economic anxiety and social disruption that the 1930s produced in their most catastrophic form, somewhere in the national archives of a dozen countries. There are documents from 1932 and 1933 and 1937 written by people who understood exactly what was happening and could not convince enough of the people around them to act on that understanding in time. Their warnings were precise. Their analysis was correct. They were overruled by the weight of short-term political calculation, by the exhaustion of populations that had already paid too much for one war, by the institutional inadequacies of systems that had not yet fully absorbed what was being prepared against them. That is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for the kind of clear-eyed, historically informed engagement with the present that the study of the past, at its best, makes possible. Anne Frank's diary sits in a museum in Amsterdam. Hans Frank's 40 volumes of administrative records sit in an archive. Both are primary sources for the same event. One was written by a girl trying to hold on to her humanity in a world that had decided to take it from her. The other was written by a man helping to take it away. In the same flat bureaucratic language of management and policy and coordination, both survived. That is not an accident. That is a choice that the post-war world made. To preserve the evidence, to remember not just the scale of what happened, but the specific human reality of it. The specific girl at the specific desk near the specific window. The specific man with the specific 40 volumes of his own words condemning him. 70 to 85 million people paid for the world you live in. Understanding what they paid for, and why, and what it means to be the inheritors of both the catastrophe and the imperfect institutions built in its aftermath, is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is the ongoing work of trying to be worthy of the world their deaths helped to make.